Mark Lackey is the Executive Vice President of CHF Capital Markets. He joins us every week with some small cap picks, typically in resources, not always, but we are focusing on fertilizers. Mark, good to see you again.
It's great to be here, and I have to say, Pat, the one positive thing is that the two areas of fertilizers we like, SOP and phosphate, have actually done fairly well as opposed to what's going on in gold and oil, for example.
Because I had the right call on gold and oil.
That's correct.
Over the short term, at least.
Well, yeah, you've been right compared to us, but it'll be interesting to see where everything goes, and we're going to be doing natural gas next week, so I'm sure that's going to create a lot of interest.
I don't have an opinion on natural gas. I'll have one by next week for you. I always like talking about fertilizer, though, yeah. and we are going to do potash, but you're also going to focus a lot on phosphate, too.
That's right.
So let's get the myriad of potash.
Yeah, I think, Pat, that's, of course, what the vast majority of people look at. Obviously, when you look at the Vancouver price, it's MOP, myriad. That market, of course, got hit pretty hard last year when Belarus and the Russians decided they couldn't get along. It's seen a bit of a recovery this year, but I mean, I have kind of moved away from MOP in the short run, Pat, and concentrated.
It's got the chloride ion, which is the interesting part of the discussion.
That's right. That's a really good point, Pat. That SOP is one that I've known about for years because
sulfate of
that's
potash.
Right. SOP, that's right. And I've followed that over the years, but then I've been really involved in that market. Whereas for a number of people, it's kind of a new situation. They didn't realize that SOP actually existed. And as you point out, the chloride ion is a factor when you look at fruits and vegetables, nuts, tea, some of the markets that are actually doing extremely well right now. And so the advantage for the SOP market, Pat, is that a lot of the MOP crops are not growing as quickly, prices aren't doing as well. On the other hand, a lot of the crops that SOP does, in fact, is used for are doing much better. So on the demand side, SOP is doing better. And then, of course, it's hard to find SOP. It's only 10% of the world's total right now. There's limited areas. Utah is a pretty good area to do business in. Some of the areas that have SOP in the Mideast, I'm not quite so enamored with. So I think that there's a real good possibility that the SOP market will continue strong. It's trading at least 2 times right now the price of MOP.
As I read through your research, though, you talk about China as a growth opportunity.
That's right.
I had no idea that they produce so much fruit and vegetables in China.
Yeah, again, Pat, that's another interesting point, that if you look at China, I mean, India is a growing producer, as is Brazil. Brazil's actually a much bigger agricultural country than most people realize. But yeah, China's actually the biggest in fruits and vegetables in the world. And they don't have a whole lot of SOP in China. So clearly, there is a significant opportunity here for SOP players. I think over a number of years, but I'm particularly interested in the next 3 to 5 years looking out. I think this market gets even tighter, and the prices probably go even higher.
Okay, so then you mentioned Utah.
That's right.
Blonde Mountain?
That's right.
Blonde Mountain?
And that's Potash Ridge, Pat. We've mentioned them before. This company really came up on my screen about a year ago because I became really enamored with SOP, and I looked around at a lot of the plays, and there weren't many of them, but the one that stood out to me was Potash Ridge, and for a whole lot of reasons. Really good management team. I like the jurisdiction, and and then I saw the execution. I mean, they told me we're going to have a pre-feas study. They had a pre-feasibility study. We're going to have an NI 4301 technical report. They did that. They got the permits for mining. They got the permits for water. They've even got an offtake agreement recently for their sulfuric acid. So, when you see a company over a year execute that well, I have to tell you, Pat, I don't see nearly that many companies that I see on the street over that last year that have executed as well as this company has. And so, and when you look at it, Pat, the cost of production minus royalties, the OPEX is in that 173 range. And so there's
what's an OPEX, like the cost of getting it out of the ground?
Right,
okay.
Right. So at the end of the day, we're looking at some pretty big margins here. And I think, again, I would say to people, if you own this, just be patient, because it reminds me of the days when I was in the mid-cap MOP companies that we got taken out 4 or 5 years ago at considerably higher prices. And there was a big takeout in the palladium market this week that did extremely well, a six bagger. So I think people still have to recognize there's still some really good small cap opportunities.
Yeah, you did mention Duluth on this show too.
I did.
Yes.
I have. Yes.
I'll give you credit for that.
Thank you.
But I found your research on phosphate was fascinating, especially the calories per capita up 25% since 1965.
Right.
But arable land per capita is down 45%.
It's interesting, Pat. I did some. I looked around to find those numbers, and it's interesting that I haven't really seen a whole lot of other people talking about this. But here's the point. If you've got the calories up significantly per capita and you got the arable land down significantly per capita. And somebody might say, well, how do you meet the food needs? Well, obviously, you have to significantly increase yields. So you've got mechanization and bigger farms. That's all happened. But the big factor has really been fertilizer. And phosphate, has a different market than potash. It's actually the demand for phosphate versus potash has been somewhat better here in the short run. But the key factor, Pat, is really on the supply side. Unfortunately, some of the phosphate isn't coming from some of the best jurisdictions in the world, let's put it that way. I mean, you mentioned today some of the ISIS situations. I mean, phosphate comes out of that part of the world, and how secure supply is some of that. I would suggest it's not secure, and Florida is not growing. There's not much phosphate coming out of Florida, new phosphate, Pat, because Florida's population growth is the fastest in the United States. And there's also a lot of big agricultural land that is already presently there.
Yeah, I was going through the list. It was Morocco, Syria,
right.
Egypt. You're right about the political
Jordan,
stability. Florida's stable, but
Morocco's not bad, but even there, Pat, there was a coup in Burkina Faso this week, and I always thought that was a pretty stable country. So, I kind of like the fact that I'm mentioning today Quebec and Brazil. I'm pretty happy with both jurisdictions in the two companies I like.
Okay, let's go through those two companies. Ariane Phosphate.
Right, so Pat, they're in Quebec. The Quebec government, which has been relatively recently elected, has actually just given some money to the company. They see the opportunity. I like the fact it's igneous, Pat. So it's
what's igneous mean?
Well, igneous is type of rock, right, as opposed to sedimentary. And the advantage of igneous is that they aren't going to have any uranium or some of the other metals that are sometimes found in phosphate. So this is a really clean phosphate, which means it's got a higher price, a better premium than, say, regular phosphate, along the lines of what you'd see with SOP versus MOP, or perhaps high quality oil compared to low quality oil. And the fact is, in North America, we got about 5 million tons a year deficiency of phosphate. So unlike potash, which is found in some very good jurisdictions, phosphate isn't. A lot of it has to be imported. When you talk to people in the business, they would love to see opportunities coming out of Quebec actually materialize, because they would prefer to see that as a secure source of supply. The work that's been done there indicates that there could be margins as much as $120 to $130 a ton in terms of their cost structure versus the price, and they could be doing 3 million tons a year within a few years. So this company right now would be trading like maybe less than 1 times EBITDA if they were actually in production. Now I realize it's a few years out, 2 to 2.5 years, but it's a great opportunity, I think, for people to buy a phosphate play in a great jurisdiction with a good management team.
Okay, right here in Quebec.
Right
and
in
the second
Quebec.
one you said is Do Solo
Right.
Fertilizers, and that's out of Brazil.
That's out of northeastern Brazil, which
It's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, though.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's on the venture, and it's largely individuals from Canada that are involved. Now they went down, Pat, and found land that had phosphate mines in the area. And the reason they went there was that they were convinced that Brazil was going to start to incentivize people to produce phosphate internally.
Well, aren't they? I thought they were a big importer.
They're a huge importer, Pat. In fact, they're huge on both potash and phosphate. And they want to try to get more. In fact, Vale has taken upon itself to do a lot more in the fertilizer area, even though we always think of Vale as just as a big mining company. So the Brazilians, people don't realize they're the biggest exporters of sugar, they're the biggest exporters of coffee, they're the biggest exporters of orange juice, they're number 2 in soybeans. So they're growing their agriculture dramatically, but their concern is they'd like to have more fertilizer from local sources. Domestic sources. And again, they're worried on the phosphate side, as we are, about some of the jurisdictions it's coming from presently. So, this is a relatively new company, Pat. It's a greenfields project, but I like what they've got because they also, in the area, some of the phosphate that's come out of the area right now, high quality, which means less processing. Point that I should have also made on Arian, that they're 39% quality. So again, high quality phosphate. So what we're trying to do here today, Pat, is go to good jurisdictions, good management teams, high quality phosphate.
We thought Peru is a good jurisdiction, though. Is Brazil as...
I will say this, that over the last 5 years, I've been far more positive about Brazil than I have Peru. And some people would have preferred maybe a different election result, but I have no problems with the way the election went in Brazil. It's still a pro-mining group. To me, Chile and Brazil are the top 2 jurisdictions in South America, Pat, and then they're among the top in the Fraser Institute. So I quite like Brazil. I don't see any changes taking place anytime soon.
Mark, great to have you on.
It's great to be here.
Mark Lackey, CHF Capital Markets Executive Vice President.